Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Eric Gardner and Sherita Johnson on Gardner's new book, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's Civil War and Reconstruction. This program is part of the ongoing celebration of Harper's 200th anniversary, and to my mind, represents a continuation of conversations begun at the Center for Black Digital Research in September and at conferences across the country. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community, who remain an active presence in central Massachusetts. I'm joining you from Delaware, which occupies lands vital to the web of life for Lenape, Nanticoke, who share their ancestry, history, and future in this region. My name is Derrick R. Spires, Associate Professor of English and Cochrane Scholar of Inclusive Excellence at the University of Delaware, where I also serve as a member of the AAS Council. As a national research library, our mission is to cultivate deeper understandings of the American past, grounded in primary sources like those in our vast pre-1900 collections. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and support of scholarship. We welcome researchers from far and wide to use the collections, both physical and digital, and we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. The program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel and on our website, americanantiquarian.org. Also, please feel free to share. We will have time for your questions later in the program, and you can post them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time. Lauren Havales, Program Coordinator, will be putting relevant information into the chat during the program, and I see she's already in action. And please know that as a private, nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep our work going. And thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers who, let me just say, are two of the most generous folks I know in the field. Eric Gardner is chair of the English department at Saginaw Valley State University. He is the author of two prize-winning monographs, Unexpected Places, Relocating 19th Century African American Literature, published in 2009, and Black Print Unbound, The Christian Recorder, African American Literature, and Periodical Culture, published in 2015. He also has edited 5 books and published a wide range of shorter works on 19th century African American literature and culture. A founding convener of Just Teach One, early African American print, Gardner has won recognition from organizations ranging from the Saginaw County NAACP to the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was elected to AAS membership in October 2024. Sherita L. Johnson is the director of the College of Liberal Arts Africana Research Center and an associate professor of English at Pennsylvania State University. She is the author of Black Women in New South Literature and Culture, published in 2009, and has contributed to African American Literature in Transition, 1865 to 1880, and Remediating Region, New Media and the U.S. South in 2021. From 2022 to 2024, she served as the president for the Society for the Study of Southern Literature. Her current projects include examining the life and writings of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, tracking Frederick Douglass in the Colored Conventions movement, and investigating African American experiences during Reconstruction. She was a Diana Korsnick Virtual Research Fellow in 2023 and was elected to AAS membership in April 2024. So class of 2024 represent today. She also co-organized the Harper at 200 celebration earlier this year, which included a symposium and a mural unveiling in Philadelphia. We'll begin with remarks from Professor Gardner, followed by a colloquy between Professors Gardner and Johnson. Enjoy.
Thank you, Professor Spires. And while I get set up, I will briefly highlight the fact that I am so happy to be here with you tonight and beyond delighted, not only that we are being hosted by the American Antiquarian Society, which has long been my happy place, but also that I get the joy of being in conversation with two of the scholars I respect probably most in the entire world, Derrick Spires and Sherita Johnson. So I am really, really excited to talk with you tonight. Folks who know something of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper will pardon me if I take a moment to reintroduce her. The reasons that we don't all know about her are worth talking about. Many 19th century Americans honored her. In 1863, William Wells Brown called her poetry soul-stirring. In 1866, a correspondent for the Christian Recorder compared her oratory to Frederick Douglass and found that for beauty of expression and rhetorical finish, she is his superior and fully his equal in warm and glowing eloquence. A decade later, Benjamin Tucker Tanner asserted that as a writer of fiction, Mrs. Harper has no equal among our people. And Monroe Majors, 1893 noted Negro woman, named her as one of the most important Black intellects of the century. Dozens of Black community groups named themselves after her. But for all of her fame, 20th century leaders, both white and Black, boxed her out of public culture. When she died in 1911, W.E.B. Du Bois's crisis obituary, for example, wrapped faint praise in disclaimers, saying she was, quote, not a great singer, but had some sense of song, and, quote, was not a great writer, but much worth reading. Black poetry anthologies of the 1920s illustrate her further expulsion from the literary world. None of her poems were included in James Weldon Johnson's 1922 Book of American Negro Poetry or County Cullen's 1927 Caroling Dusk. Newman White and Walter Jackson's 1924 Anthology of Verse by American Negroes included 2 poems. V.F. Calverton's 1929 Modern Library Anthology of American Negro Literature, only 1. Robert Kurland's 1923 Negro Poets included 2 poems, but labeled them as gentle and sweet-spirited. And her poetry was most often the most remembered part of her life's work. Even though in a transbellum public career of over 50 years, she campaigned for abolition, women's suffrage, Black suffrage, civil rights, and temperance. She gave hundreds of lectures from Maine to Kansas and from Ontario to Florida. She engaged with the Underground Railroad, the Free Produce Movement, John Brown's revolutionaries, key education efforts, the early club women's movement, and diverse faith organizations. She told white women activists, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that white women were, quote, not dewdrops just exhaled from the skies, and that if white women were going to, quote, speak here of rights, they needed to address the wrongs of racism. She told Black men that they needed to, quote, center the right of suffrage not on the claims of service or sex, but on the broader basis of our common humanity. And she did all of this work in public spaces that often shunned Black women. She was, to think of Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed. And this, along with her race and gender, begins to explain why she was pushed aside. She had no place in white reunion narratives, no ties to Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee's infamous handshake, or white men's handshakes thereafter. It wasn't until the late 1980s that Black organized projects like the Schomburg Library Series and pioneering scholars like Frances Smith Foster and Carla Peterson brought Harper back. The MLA bibliography now lists over 130 post-1990 items on Harper, more than 10 times the pre-1990 total. And this attention crosses academic boundaries. She was, for example, one of the research subjects of Dr. Yaz McKay in Netflix's The Chair, and more recently, a supporting character in HBO's The Gilded Age. But our recovery is far from complete, and it is now more crucial than ever that we remember her. For Harper sought to fashion and broaden communities based on real dialogue and collaboration. Always at risk, she fought consistently and fought hard to make a world that would be better and do better. Now that's a lot, so I'll pause here to say that one difficulty in talking about a book you've spent a decade writing that only still scratches the surface is that there is still so much. So I'm thinking a lot about approaching the big through the small. And tonight I'll talk about 2 poems, both published in book form in the early 1870s, Bury Me in a Free Land, from her 1871 poems, and Learning to Read, from her 1872 Sketches of Southern Life. They're among her best known works, and we still don't know enough about them. And so here I'm also thinking about biography via poems, or maybe biographies of poems, variations of what I call in the book, borrowing from David Blight, a biography of a voice, or ripping on Lloyd Pratt, stranger biography. Throughout, you'll also see me dancing with Professor Spires' germinal arguments about Harper remixing, I might even say reconstructing her texts. Now, you may know Bury Me in a Free Land. Central to Harper's recovery, it appears in part of the contemplative court of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where its final stanza is carved alongside quotes from Nelson Mandela, Sam Cooke, and Martin Luther King Jr. It is not a difficult poem, for all that it is an incredibly difficult poem. In a sonic tour de force of 8 4-line stanzas, each 2 pairs of rhyming couplets with increasingly powerful rhymes and stops, the poem features an introspective but also definitive first-person speaker who, when dead, will still be cognizant of the setting of their grave. Make me a grave where you will, in lonely plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. This sentence's command structure suggests the immediacy of the speaker's need, but the specificity of what follows tempts me to wonder if, rather than making a deathbed demand, the poem's speaker is already amid the harsh reality of burial in an unfree land. Again and again, the speaker tells us that they could not rest amid the evils of slavery, the tread of a coffle gang, the mother's shriek of wild despair, the bloodhounds seizing their human prey, the young girls from their mother's arms bartered and sold for their youthful charms. The poem ends, I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. It still stuns me every time I read it. Built for dramatic recitation, it invites the reader who inhabits the speaker's me to consider just who that first person might include and what slavery could cause in this world and the next. In the book, I begin to talk about the poem's long life before 1871. I explore how it was initially published in the November 20th, 1858 issue of the Ohio-based Anti-Slavery Bugle and was quickly reprinted in The Liberator. And I consider the poem's Ohio origins, given that Harper, then still Frances Ellen Watkins, had based herself in Ohio after achieving prominence in the abolitionist movement. That same issue of the Bugle also reported on her lectures around New Lisbon, Ohio, which were set up by her future husband Fenton Harper's brother Enoch, and which had been, quote, somewhat disturbed by rowdies. Aimed at Ohio readers, recited at Ohio anti-slavery gatherings, written as she crisscrossed the state, and following her stunning poem on Margaret Garner, A Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio, the poem demanded national readers, but very specifically Ohio readers, understand the graves and graveyards they were making. The poem took on new life the very next year when John Brown's raiders tried and failed to start a revolution at Harper's Ferry. Watkins spent 2 weeks with Brown's wife, Mary, after the raid, and she corresponded with the Browns and some of Brown's imprisoned soldiers. But otherwise, before, during, and after the raid, Harper was lecturing across Northwest Ohio and Northeast Indiana. There she was likely telling audiences, as she told correspondents, that Brown and his men were the heroes of the 19th century. Harper's Ferry, the Bloody Bastille, Brown's execution, a murder. A martyrdom worth more than the lives of 1,000,000 cowards. Watkins took special interest in jailed revolutionary Aaron Stevens, who, awaiting execution in the Charlestown jail, said, quote, I would give 10,000 lives if I had them to give. She arranged for William Still to regularly send Stevens a box of nice things, adding that he should, quote, spare no expense to make the last hours of Stevens's life as bright as possible. And she sent Stevens a copy of Bury Me in a Free Land, which prompted him to reply, quoting Matthew 26:38, Dear sister, I thank you for these beautiful verses, which go to the inmost parts of my soul. Stevens' engagement fascinates me as he was thinking about his burial. He repeatedly quoted from the poem in letters of the period, and he sent copies far and wide to correspondents, leading to several reprintings, some actually attributing the poem to him. In each instance, he inhabited the eye of the poem, the first-person speaker broadening to assert that all Americans should be disgusted at the possibility of being buried in a land of slaves, and should, as Stevens and Brown did, fight. These events and Watkins' purchase of a small farm outside of Columbus, Ohio in 1861 suggest that amid her Midwest itinerancy, she was not only moving from place to place physically, but reaching out to, in the language of Professor Spires' practice of citizenship, make neighborhood across the miles from Ohio. In 1859, Bury Me in a Free Land was an Ohio poem sent out again, this time a prayer for Aaron Stevens, John Brown, every American. When the poem was again republished 5 years later in 1864 as part of Harper's return to full-time lecturing, the nation was far from Harper's Ferry, and not so far. Harper had been married and widowed, had daughter Mary, helped raise her husband Fenton's 3 children from previous marriages, helped farm the 30 acres outside Columbus, and continued when she could to speak and write, penning key poems like To the Cleveland Union Savers. Leaving Ohio, she settled in Boston and began lecturing. Reconnecting with William Lloyd Garrison, she secured coverage in The Liberator, which reprinted the poem on November 4th, 1864. The only change in this version is the placement of most of the last line in italics. But Harper was not just courting Garrisonians. She was building a wide coalition of allies, including Wendell Phillips, William Wells Brown, William Cooper Nell, Ohio colleague John Mercer Langston, and Lydia Maria Child. When Garrison argued at the May 1865 American Anti-Slavery Society meeting that the group could soon be disbanded because the struggle was won, Harper, like Phillips and several of these other abolitionists, balked. Both saw a long road ahead for newly freed people, many of whom were still living amid the powers who had enslaved them. In the book, I consider this powerful moment in 1864 as demanding further thought on Donald Yacovon's amazing recovery of Harper's 1863 poem, The Massachusetts 54th, in which he argues that the 1858 version of Bury Me in a Free Land and the 1863 Massachusetts 54th, quote, form a literary diptych, with Bury Me in a Free Land showing how slavery polluted the American earth, rendering it unfit to die in, and the Massachusetts 54th, how Black soldiers redeemed the land, hallowed it, and made it flourish. But in November 1864, the poem's new moment, the war was not yet won, and the 13th Amendment not yet even out of Congress. What Reconstruction might be was the stuff of hope, worry, dreams, sometimes nightmares. There was no easy closure, no complete diptych. Harper's go-to lecture during this period was titled A Mission of the War. Reports of this lecture, and read these next to the poem, say that Harper described, quote, the causes of the war and the faithless performance of the government toward the colored man, and what the government must perform before she can triumph. Harper, quote, depicted slavery in all its horrors, at times causing the audience to weep, and treated, quote, the influence of slave power, as well as the Union's foolish initial pro-slavery policy and its slow awakening to just measures, starting with freedom and citizenship. Free land, that is, then, was not yet free. Note the final line's new italics again. In the book, I also explore Harper's personal circumstances. A Boston address appeared in many of her ads, 16 Blossom Street, the home of Harper's cousin Anne Watkins Bailey. Bailey's husband, John Baptiste Bailey, had had a storied career beginning in the 1840s as a boxer and sparring teacher for upper-class white men. He settled in Boston, opened a gymnasium, and bought 16 Blossom Street in 1860. In the book, I argue that Harper was renewing ties with the family that she trusted most, and that Mary Harper lived with the Baileys while Frances Harper traveled. The 1864 Bury Me in a Free Land then was perhaps just as much about ensuring that the residents of 16 Blossom Street, perhaps including young Garrison Bailey, who had died not long before Frances and Mary Harper moved to Boston, would have free land. For all this, the poem's first inclusion in one of Harper's collections didn't come until her 1871 poems. Readers might treat the poem here as simply a memory, a celebration of battles fought and won, even the simple gesture simply to collect an uncollected poem. But these kinds of dismissals represent a profound misreading. We must instead consider the 1871 Bury Me in a Free Land in its moment, after the Reconstruction amendments, and amid Harper's massive expansion of her geographic range and experimentation with genre, from the epic poem Moses to the serialized novel Many Sacrifice, all as white supremacists gained ground and as purported allies treated the 15th Amendment as the end of Reconstruction. Here I'll mark just two bits of the poem's new moment. First, the 1871 publication coincided with Harper's purchase of 1006 Bainbridge in Philadelphia. Today, the 3.5-story red brick townhouse with cheery blue and white trim, yes, red, white, and blue, and a National Register of Historic Places marker outside assert a happy domestic resolution. Because the U.S. got better after the Civil War, it says, this activist Black woman found peace for herself and her daughter around a warm fire in a single-family home, her own bit of urban free land. The book offers a more complicated story, recognizing that the building was never a single-family dwelling and usually had 3 or 4 separate rental units with shared baths. The Harpers did live there alongside their tenants for several years, and there might have been that cozy fire. But Harper continued her grueling lecture schedule well into the 1890s, and Mary Harper was only 9 when her mother purchased the row house. She thus often stayed with the Stills while Harper was touring. The freedom of this bit of Philadelphia land then was also about Black enterprise. Harper was investing, creating income to hedge against the difficulties of a Black public career. After Mary's untimely death in 1908 and Harper's own physical decline, the rental income from this home, and a second purchased in 1894, as well as the sale of her Ohio land, gave Harper security at the end of her life, and even paid legacies to the Bailey children, her final caregivers. A pair of essays Harper published in the Christian Recorder a year earlier, focusing on land and labor, give a fuller sense of Harper's construction of free land. Here, she argued for broader Black land ownership and praised how, quote, some of our colored women from the North, who perhaps never would have owned more than a 6x2, have gone down south and become landowners. This reference to cemetery plots surely evokes Bury Me in a Free Land, but in ways that demand consideration of the question of land ownership. Here, landowners, Black landowners, replaced slavery with Black homes and businesses, not just via crude capitalism, but in line with the Afro-Protestant liberationist moral action, homemaking in Caretha Mitchell's sense, and the creation of sanctified neighborhoods. Land ownership was not simply an end, but a way to consider heaven while attending to earth. The 1871 Bury Me in a Free Land thus demands that Americans serve as stewards of a nation built by generations of enslaved African Americans, and stewards, too, of the massive graveyards of both the Civil War and slavery. Harper was asserting that free land had to be kept free. If reaching back helps us reconsider Bury Me in a Free Land, reaching forward helps us with learning to read. That poem was originally part of a group of 6, centering on the recently freed fictional character Aunt Chloe, poems that make up most of the 24 pages of Harper's 1872 Sketches of Southern Life. And these Aunt Chloe poems take place during Reconstruction, but consciously remember the protagonist speaker's enslaved past. The 11 ballad stanzas of Learning to Read examine both the strategies Aunt Chloe's comrades in slavery used to learn to read, when, quote, our masters always tried to hide book learning from our eyes, and her own learning in Reconstruction, which she undertakes even though she is, quote, already rising 60. Now, the subject matter is deeply serious. Enslavers often deployed draconian punishments to keep enslaved people from literacy, for such knowledge offered both power and agency. However, the poem's rhythms, rhymes, and images are often light, joyful, sometimes even funny, as in the story of Uncle Caldwell, who, quote, took pot liquor fat and greased the pages of his book and hid them in his hat, thus convincing his enslaver that he couldn't possibly want to read them. Here, we're in on the jokes, and we even share in the joy of the poem's ending when Aunt Chloe learns to read and, quote, felt as independent as a queen upon her throne. Lively, accessible, treating key issues in African American history and culture, Learning to Read is now a staple of American literature anthologies. It has appeared not only in the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, Kevin Young's African American Poetry, Michael Harper's Vintage Book of African American Poetry, but in each of the editions of the now defunct Heath Anthology and the last several editions of the Norton Anthology of American Literature. But in these and many other collections, it is the only Aunt Chloe poem. Indeed, often the only postbellum poem from Harper that students see. Separated from both composition and publication context, the poem is ripe for oversimplification, nostalgia instead of argument, misreadings of Harper as gentle and sweet-spirited. In sketches, the lightness of learning to read comes only after poems that speak of the incalculable violence of slavery. Chloe's grief when her enslavers sell her children away, ongoing threats from racist unionists like Andrew Johnson, and a renewed neo-Civil War led by the Ku Klux Klan. The lightness also comes amid other poems' deep discussions of Reconstruction, the limits of legislative and moral progress, the complexities of community building, to use the terms of Professor Spires and Carla Peterson, of being neighbors in a world that still denied any sense of national mutuality. Indeed, the end of learning to read, down to the leaping rhyme thrown, suggests a level of happy resolution that the sequence itself simply never reaches, perhaps like the cozy comfort of the contemporary view of 1006 Bainbridge. Instead, I submit we should be considering learning to read as a small piece of what was one of Harper's most unified collections, something more like a chapter in Moses or Mini Sacrifice than an individual poem. In the book, I riff both on Mary Emma Graham's sense that Moses and Sketches of Southern Life should be seen as complementary texts, and Professor Johnson's suggestion that the second Aunt Chloe poem, The Deliverance, is actually a mini epic. Specifically, I argue that in content, form, and even specifics of presentation like typography down to font sizing and page headers, the Aunt Chloe poems themselves are an American epic, with Aunt Chloe as our epic hero. A new kind of Moses, if you will. Now, as background, I'll note that Harper not only reprinted sketches in the 1870s, but added both poems and prose to more than double the pamphlet's size, but continued to use the title Sketches of Southern Life, and had batches of this larger version printed in at least 1886, 1887, 1888, 1890, 1891, 1893, and 1896. I have not discovered a single instance for years when Harper arranged to have a poem or poems from the Aunt Chloe group published individually, or when she changed the sequence. In short, for several years and in several editions, readers saw all of the Aunt Chloe poems in the order, language, and mode of the 1870 edition. Together, per Frances Smith Foster, the Aunt Chloe poems form at once an autobiography of an ex-slave woman and a history of slavery and Reconstruction as narrated by that woman. And so it is crucial that she begins this history with the words, I remember, well remember, and with the searing account of her enslavers selling her children away, an act that she likens to a bullet that shot her through and through, heartstrings breaking right in two. Rebecca Rutledge Fisher suggests that the work of these poems, autobiography, story of trauma, undeclared collective memoir, is not just history, but historiography. And we regularly hear from other characters. In the first poem, from the enslaved cousin Millie, Uncle Jacob, and briefly from Chloe's son Jakey at the moment he is being sold away. And in the second, from a truly wide cast of characters, including two of Chloe's enslavers. But the same first-person speaker runs throughout, and Chloe narrates all the voices, and is not just our protagonist, but our storyteller, our conduit. And this is especially important because The Deliverance, the longest poem in the group, which is some 60 ballad stanzas, which Professor Johnson has written eloquently about, is history, and summatively works through slavery, Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union victory, the failure of enslavers to repent or even understand Black humanity, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the lives of Andrew Johnson and his cronies, the Grant administration in the upcoming 1872 presidential election, white Southerners' attempts to intimidate Black voters, how Black men might vote, and how Black women, still without the vote, might nonetheless engage. Before we fully realize that Aunt Chloe is an epic hero, we know that she is the narrator of epics. And the final section of The Deliverance moves directly into a short poem called Aunt Chloe's Politics, which ends with the striking line, "I go for voting clean." These are the contexts for the fourth chapter in the sequence, Learning to Read, which we can recognize in context as a crucial discussion of how African Americans were learning to gain not only literacy, but full citizenship. Characters in the poem, like Uncle Caldwell, are not only illustrations of how African Americans might skillfully learn to read in secret in the past, but models for how African Americans might even now engage in public systems bent on excluding them. Here, as in all, Chloe is not simply a reporting eye. To well remember, she relays community members' stories as well as her own, knowing that they may never otherwise be told. And it is in the spirit of duty and care that she inserts herself and her community into the historical record. And this means that she comes to readers in a purposeful strangerhood. She tells her story in her way and depends on us to listen in solidarity without assuming that we can ever fully understand all she and her comrades experienced, but that we can still learn from her and can engage in neighborliness. Well before learning to read, it is clear that Chloe learned long ago how to read and how to teach. Presenting learning to read alone threatens to sever it from all of this and more. That learning to read comes after Chloe's children have been stolen, never even mentions this subject, means that the anthologies can elide the epic center, and a part of what our historiography of Reconstruction must face. The repeated, complex attempts in the face of national denial and forced forgetting to reunify families and communities hacked apart by enslavers. Most troubling, separating learning to read also potentially de-emphasizes, oversimplifies the focus on Aunt Chloe and the very things that make her an epic hero, that demand more than a quick and perhaps patronizing smile when she gains her throne. For as much as learning to read remembers, it doesn't really talk about the simple fact that finding ways to survive the antebellum years of the Civil War as an enslaved Black woman and to then begin to build a flourishing neighborhood in Reconstruction was surely an epic struggle. If we lose Aunt Chloe, then we lose the figure most important to Harper. As soon as she was able to visit the Upper South, she began talking about how the stories she heard from recently freed folks, especially recently freed women, changed everything. In National Salvation, an 1867 lecture recovered and shared with the help of the Antiquarian Society, she spoke of how, quote, the cabins and humble homes of Tennessee gave her, quote, some of the most beautiful lessons of faith and trust that I have ever learned. She echoed this in speech after speech, and the title character in Many Sacrifice even says of working with recently freed folks, quote, I can't teach these people religion. I must learn from them. As she crisscrossed the South, revising how she thought about and represented that South, again, richly considered by Professor Johnson, Harper praised the power of these Black women, survivors all, and Chloe is an homage to them. Learning to read is only a tiny, safer part of a much larger picture. And in a nation celebrating easy white handshakes and presidential pardons, minimizing or repressing the trauma of slavery, and assuming that saying the land is free magically makes it so, Aunt Chloe struggles epically to think through and to practice private and public remembrance. She tells the stories. And in telling those stories, she reminds us over and over again of what free land might actually look like, how we must remix and truly reconstruct our sense of what makes up history, and how we must learn to read anew. Thank you.
We can imagine thunderous applause, right?
Thank
Thank
you for
you,
that.
Professor Gardner, for this talk. Been looking forward to it since Harper at 200 and never disappoints. And now I will turn things over to Professor Johnson as she'll reply to the richness here. So, Professor Johnson, on to you.
Thank you both. In this year of celebrations marking the 200th anniversary of Frances Harper's birth in 1825, I'm thinking here of the National Readathon of her writings launched by the Center for Black Digital Research earlier this year, the symposium convening Harper scholars here at Penn State, Among those gathered, Professor Spires and Professor Gardner both attended. The dedication of a new mural in Philadelphia commemorating Harper's legacy of community building. And now we have Professor Gardner's biography, which offers yet another wonderful gift to memorialize Harper in this year of her bicentennial. Professor Gardner weaves together fragments of letters and speeches and numerous periodical citations that bring a fuller understanding of the most crucial years of Harper's activism in writing, as he explains very well that this is the time of her life that scholars for many years have overlooked or understudied. Professor Gardner's meticulous sleuthing brings us so much closer than ever to experience what we perhaps had only imagined 19th century audiences heard in lecture halls and churches and parlors, or especially as they read about it in the press. Frances Ellen Watkins' voice resonating across genres and time. He reconstructs moments that ordinarily seem insignificant and then magnify the details to make Harper's life fully dimensional, complex, and thoroughly fascinating. There's many examples I could cite from the book, but a couple, just to name a couple, early in the book, in about the second chapter, I believe, is when we have the origin stories. And I think I annotated actually in the margins of my copy that we are all invited to a Watkins family reunion because of Professor Gardner's archival research and all the information that he recovers. And then there's also the Harper's self-promotions of her speaking engagements, which I'm really anxious to talk more about, how meticulous she seemed to have been in promoting her own her lecture and opportunities to come and talk to communities across the country. Ultimately, in reading Professor Gardner's work, what we learn about Frances Harper, the neighbor, and this is based using Professor Spires' methods. By the end of the work, I, along with many readers to come, for generations to come, I believe, will come to consider Frances Harper as a friend. So I'm very happy to start the conversation. And I guess we did get applause.
Yeah, I had to remember my Zoom U chops. Figure out how to make this work. Thank you both. And as we talk, I'll remind folks that invite folks to please put your questions into the Q&A. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Most likely click that and you'll have the opportunity to shoot your questions to Professors Johnson and Gardner. And one, I want to start with just admiration for both of you. I learn so much every time I hear the both of you talk, every time I read you. And also, Eric, what you said about Harper's poetry, it's not difficult, but difficult. It seems like Harper writes these ditties, right? She writes ballads, she writes hymns, easy to remember, but difficult to parse sometimes, like to really get a grip on what she's talking about. So I'll keep Harper's not difficult, but difficult in my back pocket from here on out. But I want to start with something that connects the two of you, because we have here, one, we tend to think about Harper, I do at least, as a Philadelphia or a Maryland person, sometimes maybe Maine, but Midwest and South, not so much. So I want to invite both of you to talk about Harper as someone who inhabits space and place and who traveled. Like, what does it mean for us to think of Harper outside of the bounds of Philadelphia, of the East Coast, of that kind of bubble? Like the image of Harper as farmer, for instance, is just, I just can't. I can't see Harper with a hoe, but I think that's kind of what you need as a farmer, right? So what does it mean to think of Harper outside of these city centers, outside of the sort of abolitionist hubs?
She is churning butter in Ohio as she's writing poems. And I could talk about that, but I would rather hear Dr. Johnson talk about her work on Southern train travel, which continues to
Okay.
fascinate me. So could I ask?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And it's funny because as each of us are looking at Harper from our sense of home, is what it really amounts to. I'm a Southerner, and one of the first ways I encountered Harper was through Al Leroy in a graduate course at some point, and I read it as a Southern novel. Just point blank. I resonate that the setting certainly draws back to slavery in the South, but it's the places in which she navigates in that novel. And then I turn my attention to what Professor Gardner did so well in the book and what we can talk about, Sketches of Southern Life, which is actually my favorite. By the title alone, it says the South meant something to her. It was very important. She memorialized it. She responded. And she created these memorable characters of Southern Black women. So that's in a nutshell what got me going. But I tend to think of her so much in the South because of just how much time she spent there. And this was quality time. This was time spent that was very dangerous. My work looking at her on the train, she spent a lot of time on trains and stagecoaches and ferry boats going in and out the South. And in tracking her travels, particularly during the Reconstruction, I find her most comfortable in places that I'm most comfortable in rural spaces in the South. And so when I see her in small towns throughout Southern Alabama, these are places that are familiar to me. And reading her 100 and so years, 200 years, or 100 and so years later, it still resonates that she got it right, that she was on the ground witnessing and recording. And that's why we're here celebrating her now. Now, to get to your concern about where she finds home, I'm also equally fascinated that when we find her promoting promotions of her lectures, oftentimes, and Eric, you can confirm this certainly, she's often known as or promoted as Frances Harper of Maryland. And this is years after she had to leave the state as a free Black woman, threatened by the passing of the threatening atmosphere of the fugitive slave law. But I'm curious as to how much she held on to that label in part of that promotions. And this is in her tours in the Northeast in the 1860s, 18 maybe early 1870s. You would find her on a bill for speaking engagements as Frances Harper of Maryland. And so that's always intriguing for me to think of her perpetual connection to Maryland. And I always liken it to how when we think of Frederick Douglass, who is also from Maryland, we can place him in New York and we can place him in DC, but Southerners, Southern literature, they keep him firmly in Maryland with his experience of slavery. We don't do the same thing with Harper as I would like. That is to think about her as a freeborn Black woman in a slave state. And what does that mean in terms of her Southernness?
And I think everything that Dr. Johnson is saying too, I mean, it reminds us that it is long overdue for us to think about Harper as a national figure,
Yeah.
someone with ties to all of these different places. I mean, I always knew that she was in Ohio because that's just sort of a base piece of the historical record, right? She was married and they lived in Ohio during the marriage, and nothing happened. And then we learned that that was wrong. That a whole bunch of stuff happened, right,
Mhm.
during her marriage, and then that she wasn't just in Ohio for that or for the teaching before it. She was actually deeply, deeply active in the late 1850s throughout the state and throughout the Midwest. There's this sort of stunning moment where I was reading one of Harper's letters, actually about John Brown. It's a letter where she mourns his execution, and it's written. The date line is Kendallville, Indiana, um, and that is maybe 15 miles from the home in which my mother, who is on this Zoom call, hi mom. Um, there you go. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Um, about 15 miles from the house in which she was born, and the house
Mhm.
where her family lived for over 100 years. So, like, I had ancestors a few miles from where Harper was writing this letter about John Brown. And
Mhm.
I, that's not to establish any connection necessarily to Harper so much as it is to recognize how widespread she was in all of these locations. And why I think, thinking about her as national and really studying her ideas of itinerancy, her ideas
Mhm.
of movement, are just crucial to working through any discussion of her work.
Mhm. Because you just can't simply pinpoint her down. I think she wouldn't even feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, which brings
Yeah.
me to thinking about both of you spend so much time in the newspapers trying to pin Harper down. So can you tell us a little bit about what it means to try to track somebody
Mhm.
who's all over the place and the sort of importance of
Mhm.
uh, really living with Black newspapers or print culture in general, but especially the Afro-Protestant press to try to like keep track of someone who seems untrackable and not in the she's
Mhm.
trying to hide sort of way.
Mhm.
Like there's the fugitivity of someone who's not trying to be captured, but Harper is, as you say, promoting and trying to be visible. I know we have some graduate students in the audience too. So can you talk just a little bit about what it's like to trace her in the newspapers?
It's exhausting for me, Eric. Once you realize like she's here, she's here, she's here, and because it's so fascinating that she was so visible and she was so important to keep track of her. And the exhaustion comes because honestly, I'm thinking, wow, how did she get from here to here in a week's time or in a day's time? And so that's where my emphasis or looking at her on train travel comes from because I'm really curious about how she moved. What was Black mobility like for a 19th century African American traveler, and particularly a woman, a single woman, a widowed woman, the safety concerns, a mother, all of these things. But the fact that again, and what I love about your book, Eric, is that how detailed it is. I went back to my class. I'm teaching a Harper seminar, a grad course to be exact, and I tell them it's like you have to read the footnotes. And that's a whole nother hour of the chapter, but it's so important. You cannot skip the notes because thankfully the way that you are citing it in the ways in which we have to track her. It's like these are snippets. It's not much. It just may be a quick notice that, Miss Harper is here. She's going to give a lecture here. Get what I love that you do well is to explain how the titles evolve depending on what publication it may appear. And so there's no easy way to keep track of her because of errors in print publications like that. But I'll let you jump in here on that. But it's fascinating and it's exhausting and it's so worth it.
Yeah. That first, I'll just say yeah to
Mm,
everything there. Um, and I think one of the things that Sherita and I both recognized relatively early on in our various projects is that we just needed we just needed to know basic information.
mhm,
I have this running joke with John Ernest about that we probably can figure out what Herman Melville had for breakfast on any given day, right? Or Emerson or Thoreau, these folks who have been so documented over and over and over again.
mhm,
But on Harper, we have months. Actually, we still have months, but certainly, earlier on in the process, we had months when we didn't know exactly where she was or what she was doing.
mhm.
And so that then becomes really the painstaking process of tracking down any possible notice. I have this massive long list of search terms that I use on various databases that kept growing and I kept messing with and still were inadequate to try and locate her, especially when she was misnamed, when there were typographical errors, when there were very conscious slights and insults built into the way that she was listed. Um, and so you just sort of dive in. Now, the fascinating thing there, and I think this is especially fascinating about looking for Harper in African American periodicals, is that I just have a real problem not wanting to read every single word that surrounds it. And because
Mhm.
there are so many stories there, right?
Mhm.
And they are generally stories that we have not allowed to come into the broader popular consciousness. And so I really sort of had these two. They weren't just mental piles, all right. They were physical piles, papers all over my living room, which my family will attest to,
Mhm.
right? And it was this is Harper stuff. This is for the
Yeah.
book. This is this
Yeah.
big old pile of stuff that I still have to consider later that might or might not have anything to do with Harper, but that, boy, that's interesting. And so
You have
the
piles, I have
both
binders.
yeah, see, you're better than me. You're
Trying to
organized.
organize it.
But yeah. I think periodicals, as we've known now for, I think, several of us for a long time, are an incredibly untapped source, not only of information about folks, but also the texts of folks.
Mhm.
And this is especially true of Black writers and activists who, had all sorts of barriers put up in front of them in terms of getting book publication or coverage in those kinds of wider arenas. And so, yeah, the newspapers are where it's at. But
I'll
also
take
not
you.
the end. There's so many other places we need to look to. Yeah.
I was just going to say quickly, I'll take you back to what you just presented on, Eric, about learning to read. You have to learn to read the newspapers to also understand and track Harper. And that's a
Yes.
whole new skill set for a literary scholar to have to go back and learn to read 19th century newspapers and to be fascinated in terms of everything from the layout, but also, again, what Eric talks about in the book, how her literature, her poetry, her sketches even may be aligned with the political news announcements of the day, or if it depending on the publication, if it's in the Christian Recorder, what are some of the religious correspondences or in the field. So you're reading her in context, and that becomes equally fascinating. And for me, I'm reading her with, oh, there's a train schedule at the top. This now let me figure out how she got from place to place, or there's advertisements for different products that to me helps to really allow us to time travel into that moment to fully understand her itinerancy as well.
I just want I could sit here and listen all night, but I want to make sure we get to some of the questions in which
Mhm.
are also great questions. And we may go over just a tad, bear with us, but I want to see how many of these questions we can get through. And I'll
I got
combine
all
a
night, Derrick.
couple. I can do this all night.
All night.
I want to combine a couple of them because they ask us to situate Harper in literary history, both relative to
Mhm.
what comes before her and what comes after her. So there's a question taking us back to Dickens' You in 2022 that paired Harper's I Will Leroy with David Copperfield and the question of influence. Can you see or trace influences from Dickens to Harper, or maybe even vice versa, or and on any lines? And the second question around Paul Laurence Dunbar spinning forward. Was Harper aware of Dunbar? How would you think about Harper's poetry relative to his, especially relating to Dunbar's use of dialect and the sort of general absence of dialect in most of Harper's work?
Mhm.
Oh,
I'll
wow.
I'll address the Dunbar one slightly, and that's only coming from my teaching. uh, as beautiful and as complex as the dialect in Dunbar's work, when you align it with the dialect that appears more so in Owl Leroy, some of her characters representing those formerly enslaved in dialect, and you get a little bit of Aunt Chloe as well. It's it's hard not to imagine that they were reading. They certainly these were small circles of African American writers, and Harper was an avid reader. Amazing collection of reading, and when you read her literature, you see references to other things that you see that she's integrating into that. So the influence question, I think it will be it's not just a simple guess. I think you can firmly rest that there was some connections or they were aware of it, particularly the Dunbar Harper because of that. But I like to teach them together for that reason, so you can see someone who with Dunbar was really trying to perfect the authentic Black voice of a folk character, as Harper remembered from her travels as well.
I think the exciting thing about both your remarks, Professor Johnson, and the question itself is that it demands that we begin to situate Harper in the much broader landscape of
Mhm.
19th century America, which is something that we
Mhm.
just haven't done. Dickens
Mhm.
especially fascinating for me because He returns to the States, right, and does this sort of national tour, relatively late on. And one of the halls that he lectures in is the National Hall, where she gives national salvation. And they're in that building within about a year of each other, and it's in Philly. It's in the realm of possibility that Harper went to see Dickens, but even if not, they sit next to each other in so many places. Did she read Dickens? Yeah, I absolutely, certainly, certain of that. Yeah, but did that mess with all sorts of stuff? Yeah, because, and I'm thinking here about the fascinating work that's been done on Hannah Crafts, especially by Greg Hasimovich, right? That really sort of thinks about, oh, okay, she read Dickens and then she messed with Dickens, right? And so putting them next to each other is not a simple question of influence or of copying or plagiarism or any of those kinds of things. Rather, really, it's Harper sort of thinking about. I'll use your term, Derrick. She's thinking about how to remix all this stuff, how she fits in dialogue with all of it. And so, yeah, I think it's totally appropriate to set Dickens next to, or Harper next to Dickens. Many Sacrifice would be my novel of choice for doing that, which I suppose we could talk about more later. But Iola Leroy, because its roots are very much in Many Sacrifice, I think also sits really, really richly in dialogue with Dickens. Yeah.
If I had my 2 cents, I'd say the sketches, fancy etchings, because of Dickens's proclivity for the sketch.
It's just
Everybody
my
was on
buzz.
board
Yeah.
with the sketch. Um, but back to the questions. Since you mentioned Iola Leroy, we have a question from Doug Jones about Francis Harper and Black nationalism, particularly choice of characters in Iola Leroy and Many Sacrifice, in Moses, and in other places to refuse to pass, like the anti-passing literature that someone like Gabrielle Foreman will talk about. So can you talk a little bit about what Black nationalism might mean for someone like Francis Harper? Can we see it cropping up in her literature, her poetry, her novels, etc.?
I think maybe the first thing that I would probably want to get on the table is that um, I think scholars have radically underplayed the presence of Black nationalist thought in the earliest 19th century work and throughout the 19th century work. And I think some of that comes from this really sort of radical oversimplification of thinking about Black nationalism as something that is very, very much a mid to late 20th century phenomena that belongs to a small handful of folks. When Black nationalism is actually a much larger panoply, all sorts of different ways of approaching that question. And once we begin to think about Black nationalism more broadly, we can recognize that it's a crucial motivating force in all of the colored conventions movement. That's really sort of Black nationalism in action, because they are, in essence, creating this separate governing structure, complete with constitutions and rules and resolutions and all of those kinds of things. And if you broaden Black nationalism and think about it in dialogue with the colored conventions movement, you also then can recognize that Harper grows up in a home that is very much Black nationalist, because William Watkins is really thinking in those kinds of terms, and that when she moves to Ohio and functions within church conventions there, like Lewis Woodson's brother is one of the ministers who she meets. And Lewis Woodson, a really early, really important early Black nationalist who, again, we don't pay nearly enough attention to. And so she's in dialogue with these issues from the time that she can talk, listen. And I think then comes, through a variety of different kinds of shifting moments, more and more to recognize that, as always, right? All the way through slavery, as free African American folks, Black folks have to take care of Black folks, because the boundaries between race, the sort of dismissal of Black humanity stops other folks from treating Black folks as neighbors by and large. And so Harper, I think, is Black nationalist not only by choice, but also just by sort of recognition of who's actually going to do the work, who can actually be trusted. Doesn't mean she's not willing to reach out and form really exciting coalitions, but it also means that she is always, always, always conscious of protecting Black folks.
Mhm. I totally agree with what you're saying. And I'm thinking even, I kept hearing the phrase a nation within a nation, how she's very much mindful of her mission is to certainly to have a more integrated interracial society with equal rights. However, she's very conscious of how Black people are forced to work together or have to build community, particularly coming out of the Reconstruction period. But also, I'm thinking in the work that you do very well in looking at her relationships with the Black press, getting her message out to Black people through these very platforms. That's a way I think that we can understand her Black nationalist strategies and how she speaks directly to audiences in print, um, particularly from certain publications like the Christian Recorder. Like she's thinking, I think as you speak well of, and so in the reaping that she doesn't have to identify her characters as Black. It's serialized in a Black paper. Black people will see themselves in this, or at least they can understand what this world, that experience is like. And so I think just to again to agree with what you were explaining about how we need to really think more critically about what Black nationalism looked like in the 19th century, and particularly from the perspective of Harper, who's writing through this. And then she's very aligned with some of the maybe more radical Black nationalist figures in some of her activism, whether it's Delaney or others, or excuse me, Garnett, Henrietta Garnett. It's like these are figures that she also, again, I love the moments where we hear her in your work really speaking radically and not as this genteel poet. Like this is her nationalist rhetoric here.
Nationalist, but also funny. Like Eric, you
Mhm.
talked about deliverance and learning to read. My favorite Chloe poem is actually The Reunion, because
Mhm.
at the end of it, she goes, "Oh, Mrs. got no power now to tear us both apart. I'm richer now than Mrs. because I've got my son, and Mr. Thomas, he is dead, and she's got nary one." It's kind of it's a knife, it's a press. Aunt Chloe's dancing on the grave almost. And then
Mhm.
we're off to the races with the rest of Southern sketches, but there is an edge to Harper that often gets
Yeah,
overlooked.
yeah,
I want to
certainly.
turn to a question from Nazira Wright, who has an imminent book drop on Harper's, among other things, Harper's library. So if you want to know more about
Yes.
what Harper may have been reading or
Yeah.
had access to,
Yeah.
keep an eye out. That book drop is imminent. But the question is asking us to think about family in concrete terms, in sort of biological terms. Can you talk to us a bit about Harper's daughter and maybe more broadly the relationship between these Black women lecturers like Harper and Harriet and Louisa Jacobs,
Mm.
Gertrude Bastille Mosel's daughters. So Harper as mother, Harper as in relationship with other Black women, Black women's relationships on the circuit.
Mm.
There are like books that need to be written on this. I'm actually hoping that I can't wait for Professor Wright's book either. And I'm hoping that the next one does the same kind of, general work in that way. Um, but yeah, Mary Harper is just stunning. And there's really not a lot written about her. Uh, Martha S. Jones has a wonderful piece that sort of, oh wow, we should talk about this. But there has not been a lot. But she alone is quite fascinating. Also trained as an elocutionist. At times read some of Harper's work. Did a bit of touring. It looks like suffered from and was limited in the touring by health conditions that we haven't been able to quite pin down yet. And of course, she predeceases Frances Harper,
Mm.
um, which I'm still sort of, uh, what drama sort of built in there. Um, but I think one of the things that I am hopeful of is that, and this is why I spend so much time. Sherita, I was glad you talked a little bit about chapter 2 and about the Watkins family there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We need to situate these folks,
Yeah.
and so this she's not just the lone author, right? She has a
Mm-hmm.
daughter. For a while, she has a husband. She has she has this extended family, the Baileys,
Mm-hmm.
who work with her throughout her life and take care of her at the end of her life. And so, sort of putting her in those places is sort of step one, and then sort of stepping back and thinking about, oh, these folks were reading texts too, and some of them were probably
Mm-hmm.
writing texts, and some of them might have been speaking texts publicly. And so, really beginning to move away from just the single author to think about Black communities of print and Black communities who are joined by these textual media, across the miles. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think there's a gigantic amount of work left to do.
Yeah.
And when we talk family, we're not even yet right situating folks within community. One of the exciting things about Professor Wright's work is that she sits Frances Harper next to Gertrude Bustle Mosel and says, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Mosel borrowed Frances Harper's library ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that right?"
Mm-hmm.
And just to sort of think about the kinds of networks that we have ignored, dismissed, just sort of consciously chosen not to talk about, when in fact those networks were present and were powerful forces in the creation of the literature that we're talking about now. So yeah, so much work to be done on
Yeah.
so many folks.
I'm also excited to hear more from Professor Wright from her presentation at the symposium that gave us just a little bit of a taste. So we're ready for it.
And I think we have time for one more question, and I'll again try to combine a few in a way that hopefully makes sense because we have questions about audience, who did Harper write for, primarily Black audiences, white audiences, et cetera, but also questions about um, how Harper strategized around Reconstruction. So, somewhat in concrete terms, around, I would say, questions of suffrage, around education, around property ownership, all of the big issues. So, and connecting the two questions, navigating uh, different kinds of audiences, white women audiences, Black women audiences, church audiences, regional audiences, et cetera. So, in sum, coming back to the title of Eric's book, what is Harper's Reconstruction?
Well, you got to read the book first, right? With no, I know you have already, so I'm dangerous to say that, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there we go. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
It is this. Well, actually, Derrick, I'll remember aloud something that you said a long time ago that has stuck with me, and it's that there seems to be a Harper for every season, a Harper for every moment, right? And even as she is deploying the same text, sometimes the identical text, she's doing it at different moments and in different ways. She is sort of consciously reconstructing the way that she is interacting with the broader American populace, and I think that that word, right, sort of reconstructing, begins to recognize how often she has to pivot and how lively she has to be in thinking about both the possibilities and the moments when those possibilities bluntly get destroyed. One of the things that was sort of most striking to me is there's an account of Harper being in the Senate gallery when one of the key pieces of civil rights legislation passes. And it's not Harper didn't write the account; it's written about her being there. And the person writing the account says that she said this. Did it pass? Did it pass? Does that mean it passed? And when the answer is yes, she begins weeping. And what a roller coaster is not a good enough analogy, right? As Harper moves through Reconstruction, she has to navigate so many changes, so many shifts, so many moments when purported allies step back or deny her or deny slavery or deny that there is a continuing need to think about civil rights. And every time there is a victory, 1870, the passage of the 15th Amendment, there is also a stunning, devastating defeat. All of these old abolitionist fighters who she had allied herself with for years come out and say, oh, well, 15th Amendment, we're done. Black folks have all they need. And we don't need to think about the fact that slavery might actually have complicated legacies. And so, and this is, in the end, I think one of the things that just amazes me most about Harper. She kept going. She would face that defeat and over and over and over again, right? She would get back in there. And I'm not going to use the word resilient. I hate that word. I think it emphasizes, or I think it de-emphasizes trauma way too much, right? Oh, they're resilient. And we can explain away the trauma. Harper is in there fighting over and over and over again. Even when it's clear that Reconstruction has failed, she is still writing, still speaking. And I think, you're right to highlight to white audiences, to Black audiences, to rural audiences, to urban audiences, to folks throughout that whole chunk of the nation, right? Maine to Florida, Ontario to Kansas. She's just always still in there. And so her reconstruction is, I think, this continuous reconstructing of herself to try and figure out how the nation could be reconstructed, should be reconstructed, and ultimately was not reconstructed.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Please join me in giving our panelists another roaring round of applause.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Derrick and Sherita, thank you so much.
Thank you both.
I love talking with you
all the celebrations.
Please join us for our next virtual program on Thursday, November 20th at 2 p.m. for a program in our book talk series featuring Matthew Brown and his new book, The Novel and the Blank. These and many other programs are listed on our website where you can register in advance. All programs are free of charge. Thank you again. Thunderous applause all the way around. Have a great night, everybody. Buy the book, read Harper.